some dreams come true.
Does America have concentration camps to put away protesters and rioters? It seems that every time there is a violent demonstration or a riot on the campus or in the ghetto, the rumor starts to spread again about concentration camps for the rioters. What are the facts? In 1950, the Congress passed the Mccarran Act. A little-known section of that act, Title II, provides that in case of war, invasion, or insurrection at home in aid of a foreign enemy, the President can proclaim an internal security emergency, and then the Attorney General can arrest and detain anyone he thinks will probably commit sabotage or espionage. In effect, the law permits the United States government to jail people without the usual charge or trial or legal defense. In 1952, the government actually designated 6 places as detention camps. What has happened to them? The director of the U.S. Bureau of Prisons, Merle Alexander.
Well, the truth of the matter is that we have no concentration camps. We have no camps in our system that are designed or planned for the detention of persons other than those who are normally convicted of violation of federal crime. We operate the federal prison system, and there are no concentration camps or any kind of camps under that old act of 17, 18 years ago.
But 17 years ago, there were 6 detention camps like this one. None of them was ever used as a detention camp for one simple reason. Not one single American has ever been arrested under Title II of the Mccarran Act. This campsite is at Reno, Oklahoma. The land adjoins a federal reformatory. All that remains of the original campsite is a water tower and a barn to house the reformatory's cattle. A second camp is at Florence, Arizona, designated as a political detention center in 1952, but never used for that purpose. Congress stopped appropriations for all 6 camps in 1953. By 1958, none of the camps were any longer considered Mccarran Act detention centers. Today, the Florence facility houses 75 temporary inmates awaiting trial for various federal offenses. A third is Allenwood Prison Camp in Pennsylvania. To the outsider, it's hard to tell where the municipal golf course ends and the prison begins. You can tell when the work call siren goes off. Allenwood makes furniture for government agencies. It is a minimum security prison now. A fourth site is at Wickenburg, Arizona, once designated a detention center, never used, then sold back to the town. There was once an airport here, but even that has been abandoned to the desert. The 5th camp was at Avon Park, Florida, designated a detention center in 1952, never used. It was turned over long ago to the state. It is now used as a state correction institution. And this is the last of the 6 campsites, Tule Lake in Northern California near the Oregon border. It was sold off some time ago to private investors. But if none of the original campsites exists as a political detention center today, the law that set them up is still on the books. In the event of an emergency, the government, according to the law, could designate just about any place as a detention camp. This campsite at Tule Lake may now be enjoying its status as a migratory labor camp and a hunting lodge for duck hunters. But once, there were 20,000 Americans detained here, and it was a detention camp. Some even called it a concentration camp, American style. This was one of the 10 camps during World War II where 110,000 Americans of Japanese descent were kept under armed guard on grounds of national security. To the Japanese American, talk of concentration camps or detention camps is more than just talk. They lived through it. They lived through one of the most bizarre pages in American history from early 1942 to 1945, when almost the entire Japanese American population, 2/3 of them native-born Americans, were evacuated from California's west coast, placed in detention camps, their property often confiscated, their freedom taken away, their constitutional rights abrogated, No charges, no trials, no right to confront their accuser, no juries, no courts, no lawyers, only because they were of Japanese descent. The California Attorney General who urged the evacuation and detention was Earl Warren, who would later become the most liberal Supreme Court Chief Justice in history. The evacuation was ordered by a liberal President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, and was supported by the mass of public opinion. In 1944, the evacuation was upheld by the Supreme Court, the decision written by one of the court's great liberals, Justice Hugo Black, and concurred in by another court liberal, William Douglas. The court, however, has never ruled on whether the detention camps themselves were constitutional, a question that has not been resolved to this day. There never was a single reported case of espionage or sabotage committed by a Japanese American in World War II, and if other Americans have forgotten this episode in our history, the Japanese Americans have not. Today, one of them is a leader in the bipartisan move in Congress to repeal the detention camp section known as Title II. He lost an arm in combat in Italy in World War II, and he holds the Distinguished Service Cross. United States Senator from Hawaii, Daniel Inouye.
Well, most of us were aware of the existence of Title II in the Internal Security Act, but nothing was done up until now. But recently, as you know, we've been having problems in the large urban centers, and one of the causes we noted was the existence of Title II. People were threatening the use of detention camps to detain black militants, and I thought the time had come to take this out of the law books. There's no place for concentration camps and detention camps in our democracy. But yet people say, well, it will never happen. But it's still fresh in my memory that it did happen. That right after December the 7th, 109,650 Americans, but Americans of Japanese ancestry, were detained because of one thing, color. And I would hate to see this happen again. Now, as far as the chances of passage, I'd say excellent. About 25% of the Senate have co-sponsored this. And the unusual part of this, there isn't a single opponent. So I would say it's going sailing through.
Ironically, it was the liberals in Congress who in 1950 pushed through the Mccarran detention camp law. Their strategy was to ward off what they considered even more repressive measures. Conservatives in Congress attacked it as a concentration camp law, but it passed. And in 1952, Senator James Eastland of Mississippi urged Congress to use the camps to jail 50,000 alleged communists.
Now, what you quote me as having said is true. We were at war in Korea with communism directed from Moscow. And I did not think the Internal Security Act, which had been on the books a year, was being properly enforced. And I wanted to raise a little hell to see if I could get some action.
Today, however, Eastland, chairman of the Judiciary Committee, has introduced his own bill to repeal the law that made these camps possible. We asked Senator Eastland why he has changed his mind.
Mike, I was opposed when the Mccarran Act was passed to detention camps. It was a matter that was put in the bill by the liberals. As I recall, the New York Times endorsed detention camps editorially on the 12th day of September during that fight.
You, Senator Eastland, want the detention camps done away with it. That's the nub of it. Why?
Well, I don't think we need the detention camps. You know, I've changed my mind just like the New York Times has changed its mind.
Senator, there are a good many Negroes and students, new leftists, who feel that the detention camp provisions of the Mccarran Act could be used against them. Now, James Eastland is not perhaps the best-known civil libertarian in the United States, and yet he wants to do away with the detention camps. I ask you again, why?
Well, I have just explained that I don't think they're necessary. It's just that simple.
Eastland's critics think he's for repealing the detention camp section to make the rest of the law tougher. But what gives rise to suspicion the government may still want to use detention camps is a report like this one by the House Committee on Un-American Activities last year, discussing the possibility of guerrilla warfare in our cities. Detention camps, it says, might well be utilized for the temporary imprisonment of warring guerrillas. One committee member says that possibility is remote, but he defends detention camps. Congressman Albert Watson of South Carolina.
Frankly, I think that this is a good act. It should be available in the event there should be an open, declared state of guerrilla warfare in this country. And we must bear in mind that the progressive labor movement, the Students for a Democratic Society, and many of the others now are calling for open revolution in this country, openly admitting that they are revolutionary communists. However, they say spell it with a little c because they do not even submit to the discipline of the regular Communist Party.
Critics of the detention law were nettled by a recent issue of the Atlantic magazine quoting the Deputy Attorney General Richard Kleindienst as saying that student demonstrators who interfere with others should be rounded up and put in a detention camp. Kleindienst says that he was misquoted. But what is Justice Department policy? The head of the Civil Rights Section, Jairus Leonard.
The Justice Department has the obligation to defend the act because it is the law of the land, and to the extent we are obliged to defend the statutes that Congress enacts, I presume that we have a position in favor of that section.
Rumor, there are 1 million detention warrants ready to be used. True or false?
Answer, false.
Rumor, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI has a pickup list running into the thousands to arrest people and put them into detention camps. True or false?
Well, let me equivocate to this extent. I don't think that we should be so naive in this country as to believe that the Bureau, which has an obligation to protect this nation from foreign subversion, does not know where foreign subversives are in their activities in this country. But if your question relates to campus dissidents, to those who are expressing protest in this country, the answer to that is false. It does not have such a list.
But to campus dissidents at Berkeley who were sprayed by helicopter with disabling gas, the government's reassurances are not persuasive. On militant campuses and in the ghettos, rumors are rife that detention camps will be used someday. So far, the constitutionality of the detention camp law has been challenged only once in court. The case was dismissed, but the lawyer who lost intends to appeal. Dennis Roberts.
They pretend there are no camps, there is no possibility of a threat of enforcement of the act, but they also loved having the act there because from time to time they kind of toss it out a little bit and scare people. And that's really the basis for keeping the act alive right now. They want to use it as a scare technique, keep people frightened, keep them intimidated, keep them from participating in protected First Amendment conduct, because when you have an act as vague as this one, where you can be incarcerated for probably engaging in or probably conspiring with others to engage in espionage or sabotage, when you're dealing with that kind of vague and overbroad definitional standards, you don't know what's going to get you put into a concentration camp. You don't know if today a protest against the war is tomorrow going to be grounds which will be deemed sufficient to incarcerate you in a camp.
The government has never used this law, says it does not intend to. Then why doesn't the government come out for its repeal?
Well, I don't know that it's been said that it never intends to use it. I think it's certainly is clear that there is no intention to use it on those who engage in peaceful protest or protest within the United States who are not in the employ of a foreign government or working on behalf of a foreign government. There certainly could be a time in the future if this country were attacked, as the act said, where there was a declaration of war by the Congress of the United States, or where there was an insurrection within the United States that was aiding a foreign enemy, when the act could be used. But I think that's fairly remote today.
Are you saying that the Justice Department would never use Title II, the detention camp provision, for purely domestic subversion? That is, college students, racial riots, demonstrations of that kind, or even rioting of that kind?
I would say, Mr. Wallace, that that's correct. I would say it's correct because there is no need to use this kind of law. There is adequate other criminal law on the books which could be used in lieu of this kind of a proposition.
There is an interesting but yet frightening footnote in our history of detention camps. Once people said this will never happen. It did happen in 1940. And when the Supreme Court was asked to act upon the legality of this measure, the Supreme Court refused to do so. Therefore, as far as we're concerned, concentration camps are legal in the United States of America, and this is a blot in our democracy. And I hope that the repeal of Title II once and for all will clear this up.
The bills to repeal the detention camp provision of the Mccarran Act will come before the Congress in the months just ahead.
The Watergate drama has thrown up to the American audience a whole cast of characters who only a few months ago were either unknown or known only to a few Washington insiders. Well, tonight we profile one of them, Senator Daniel K. Inouye, the sober senator from Hawaii, whose tough questioning of John Ehrlichman and H.R. Haldeman led their attorney, John Wilson, to refer to him as that little Jap. True, Inouye had, in a stage whisper heard by millions of people, called John Ehrlichman a liar. True, he had dredged up some questionable campaign activities conducted by Bob Haldeman way back in 1962. The little Jap remark, despite Mr. Wilson's denials, was clearly a racial slur, which, considering the presence of Japanese Premier Tanaka in Washington, must have been somewhat embarrassing to the president. Well, just who is the senator Attorney Wilson called that little Jap? We went to Washington to talk to him. He began by recalling his first days as a congressman.
Well, you must appreciate this. This was my first day as a member of the House. I'm sitting across one of the world's most powerful men, Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn. And he's looking at me in all his severity. He says, young fella, I want you to know that in Washington, D.C., I'm the best known fella. Everyone knows Sam Rayburn. I says, oh yes, Mr. Speaker, everyone in the world knows Sam Rayburn. He says, no, not that far, but in Washington, I am number one. And next to me, you'll be the best known. And so I looked at him, Mr. Speaker, you know, well, what do you mean by that? He says, well, young fella, there are not too many one-armed Japanese congressmen.
Daniel Inouye has been case-hardened by life. The slums of Honolulu, where he was born, are now a bittersweet memory. Today he lives in comfort in suburban Maryland. 30-odd years ago, he set out to prove that he was as loyal an American as anyone. In the process, he won the Distinguished Service Cross, and he left an arm behind on the battlefields of Italy.
Oh, this was about 48 hours after I lost my arm, and this nurse came by and she says, Lieutenant, you want a cigarette? I says, oh, yes, ma'am. So she threw a brand new pack at me. And I looked at her and I wanted to curse her because I felt she should open the pack for me. And so for the first time in my life, I opened a pack with one hand. With my teeth, just bit it off. Finally got the cigarette out, I put it in my mouth, and she came by and she says, oh, you need a light. And she tossed a book of matches at me, and she walked away. About then, I was ready to throw rocks at her. And I tried to light this match, and nearly burnt myself, and I gave up, and she came by again, and she said, you quit smoking? That's a good thing, you know, smoking's not good for you. And so I said, why don't you light it for me? She looked at me and says, you know, I'm not going to be around you all the time. No one's going to be following you all your life to light your cigarettes and tie your shoelaces. You know, you're big enough. You're not a baby. You better learn how to do things. And so she took out a book of matches, and she said, all you got to do is to bend it forward like this, and then flick. There it was. From then on, I became completely self-reliant. A few things I can do better than men with both arms. The
rehabilitation program in the hospital required all of us to take up some musical instrument. And I tried the trumpet first because you can do it one hand, but then the instructor said, no, you're hopeless, your lips are too soft. So I looked around and I saw this piano teacher. He was a black fella, and he just had one arm. And so he and I got along famously, and in 2 months I had my graduation. And so he wanted to know, what song do you propose to play for your graduation? And I've got a big ego, so I said, Danny Boy, naturally.
Inoue may be the all-American senator, but his family life is played by traditional Japanese rules. In this Watergate summer, his wife remains with Daniel Jr. in Hawaii. Like his father before him, the senator is positive about a woman's place.
He insisted that my mother stay at home. He refused to have her go out to work. He felt that it was her job to care for the children. So I come from a very traditional, conservative background.
Do you keep that up in your own household, or a form of that?
Some of my friends call me, well, the women's lib friends call me one of those pig names. I insist that my wife stay at home, and she agrees with me. She cares for our son, and this is a full-time job.
Inoue is an American because his grandfather left Japan for Hawaii to find work, to make money, to pay off a family debt of honor. It is called on in Japan, the concept of face. He is a Methodist because his mother was an orphan and raised by Christian missionaries.
It would have been unheard of on her part to have married anything but Methodist. And here was my father, a Buddhist, and he fell in love with her. And she must have told her in no uncertain terms, you want to marry me, you become a Methodist. And so, in fact, when I was named, she was intent upon naming me Daniel, but she had to get, some reassurance from the Almighty. So she closed the Bible and she opened it up, and it opened to the book of Daniel. She said, that's it.
Young Danny grew up in two cultures, Japanese at home, American in the streets. He and his friends were always pretending that their skin was white and their eyes were blue.
Race or racism was a very important factor in your lives.
Oh, yes. We knew what we were, and we knew what the circumstances were at that time. We wanted desperately to be Americans. We wanted desperately to have other Americans look upon us as Americans. And many of us concluded, especially those of us in the college level, that the only way to do this was to volunteer for military service. We were unfit for service by the rule of the Department of the Army.
You mean as Japanese?
Oh, yes. We were considered 4E, I believe, which was not quite 4F. But, so we could have sat this war out, but we felt imperative that we go through this demonstration of loyalty and allegiance.
Inoue was 17 when the Japanese attacked at Pearl Harbor.
It was a Sunday. We had gotten up, as we do every Sunday, to get ready for church services. I turned on my little radio, and suddenly the voice of a very frantic announcer telling us about the bombing, that this is not a test, it is not a maneuver, this is the real thing, we are being attacked. And so my father and I went out on the street, and we lived several miles from Pearl Harbor, but you could see the anti-aircraft puffs in the Pearl Harbor area. And one group of aircraft just zoomed over our area, and you looked up there and you saw the red ball, the rising sun.
What did you feel yourself, though, as a young man of 17? Did you feel torn apart by a sense of divided loyalty or of guilt because of what had come from your ancestors?
I had no divided loyalty as far as I was concerned.
I immediately looked upon Japan as my enemy, my personal enemy. In many ways, I felt that the people of my ancestry had betrayed us because we had looked upon this country as a great country.
But to white America, it was a question of loyalty. And Japanese Americans on the West Coast were rounded up and relocated in camps.
I know how my comrades felt, those who had been uprooted from their homes on the West Coast and herded off into racetracks and concentration camps. I used to always, and I still marvel over the fact that these men volunteered from behind barbed wires. Now, I always ask myself, would I have done the same thing? Now, you must remember, our circumstances were a bit different in Hawaii. Our neighbors were friendly, and no one pointed fingers at us. But in California, it was a different thing. And they were all herded into these camps, and yet they volunteered in large numbers, and they fought well. I still recall a sergeant in my platoon who was killed by a grenade, and almost precisely at that moment, his home was being burnt by vigilantes in California.
The Japanese-American regiment, the 442nd, was nicknamed Go for Broke. It was the most decorated combat outfit in the Second World War. It took the highest casualties. On the battlefields of Italy, Inoue was raised from private to sergeant to lieutenant. Days before the war ended, a grenade blew away his right arm. He was sent home. And before presenting himself to his family, he stopped off for a haircut in California.
I was in an officer's uniform. I had 4 rows of ribbons. I had my officer's bars. A big, bona fide hero. So I walked in. One barber approached me and he says, what are you? I says, what am I? I need a haircut. He says, you're a Jap? I says, no, I'm an American. He says, but you're a Jap? I says, well, if you mean what my parents were, I said, yeah, my father was born in Japan. We don't cut Jap hair here. Well, I would have expected that in 1942 or 43, but this is 45, the war's over. At that point, I didn't know what to do. I had a hook in where my hand used to be. I thought, well, should I slug him or break up the place? But then I thought, now, if I slugged him, then everything I'd done up until now would have been wasted. So I just looked at him, and I says, I feel sorry for you, and I walked out.
The kid from the slums came home a changed man. He went to war speaking pidgin English. In hospital, fellow officers decided to make him over.
And they figured I might be a good Pygmalion, Eliza Doolittle. And so there was a fellow who taught public speaking. He had a master's degree. He was a regular college instructor. He grabbed hold of me. There was another one who taught me how to play bridge. Another one taught me how to lay out the silver on a table. Another one taught me how to order wine. They wanted to develop a gentleman. So when I returned home in my captain's uniform with all the ribbons, that in itself must have been most impressive to my folks. I had left home in an ill-fitting private uniform. Here I am, driven home by a chauffeur in a captain's uniform. And when I began speaking, my mother looked at me and she said, you speak just like a haole, which means a white man.
A Japanese white man was also the perfect candidate to represent the 250,000 Japanese Hawaiians as the territory approached statehood. He won a seat to the House, then to the Senate. In 1968, he was re-elected with a phenomenal 83% majority. His record was liberal and predictable, a party regular.
During that period when you did support the war in Vietnam, were you Lyndon Johnson's man?
I would put it this way, the president was very generous with his time with me. He was good to me. I looked upon him, as I still do, as a friend. I liked him very much. I had the honor of seconding his nomination in Los Angeles. This is when we lost. I must say that my support for Vietnam was in some sense conditioned by my friendship. I would be less than candid if I said otherwise.
Is that an extension of the Japanese sense of obligation?
Very definitely, sir. And to say now that I would have done otherwise would be not only less than candid, I think, be intellectually dishonest with you.
It was the massacre at My Lai that changed Daniel Inouye's mind about the war. My Lai seemed to end whatever obligation he felt.
At that time, people of the United States were made aware of this My Lai incidents. Now, I had gone through combat, and I received a field commission as an infantry officer. And an infantry officer gets a field commission generally because he's a good soldier. And what is a good soldier? One who kills very efficiently, who knows how to do the business of an infantryman. And I suppose for the rest of my life I'll have to go along knowing that I killed very many men. But never during my service as an infantry sergeant or an officer or a rifleman would I have ever considered shooting a woman, an old lady, or children. And here we had a situation where women and children were lined up like animals and just shot cold-bloodedly. And then when I began adding the common use of gooks, sloops, and the fact that they were looked upon as inferior people, I couldn't help but feeling that there was an unfortunate element of racism involved. That's when I said, I've had it.
Daniel K. Inouye is an unabashed patriot, whose American patriotism is enriched by his Japanese sense of honor.
When I left Hawaii to put on a uniform, my father took his day off. He asked his boss may he'd take the morning off. And he accompanied me on a streetcar to the point of embarkation to get on the trucks to go to the camp. And he was unusually very quiet. Well, there isn't much you can talk about when you're leaving like this. The only thing he told me was, remember, the country's been good to you. So you have a own, you got to pay back.
So much for the senator who the distinguished Washington attorney John Wilson called that little Jap.